pulling your student out of class time and time again every day, or nearly every day, then that should be the first red flag, right?
Welcome back to Parallel Justice, the podcast that dives into the crimes and cases that have dominated the national headlines through exclusive interviews with the very attorneys who fought the cases. Some of the discussion you hear today may be controversial. However, we know that silence, especially on tough issues, only enables and encourages wrongdoers. It's our goal to bring these issues to light so that we may have meaningful discourse around them. The views expressed in this podcast are those of our guests, who are experts in these areas. Their opinions are invaluable, however, they do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Center for Victims of Crime. The topics we discuss may be disturbing, and they are intended for adult audiences only. Some of these topics may also be triggering, and we encourage you to practice good self-care and seek support. I'm Renee Williams, Executive Director of the National Center for Victims of Crime, and your guide through this conversation. Now, let's start the show. Welcome to another episode of Parallel Justice. I'm your host, Renee Williams, and joining me today is a return guest who always seems to get the most interesting cases out of New Jersey, which is impressive because it's a state full of interesting cases, attorney Jeff Fritz. And Jeff, before we get into this particular case, do you want to reintroduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. Good morning, Renee. Thank you so much for having me back on. Always good to talk to you, whether on air or not on air. So I'm an attorney in Philadelphia based, but I practice in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and different spots around the country, California, etc. So great to be back on.
And you just won a verdict of $1.6 million and then a settlement of another $2 million in punitive. And we're going to talk about the differences there. But the case is Doe v. Camden Schools. And on the surface, this is a pretty deserving case to talk about, but it's a standard school abuse case. But things got a little crazy as you went into litigation. And if our listeners Google the case, it's really actually hard to follow a thread of what happened. So can we just start out with the facts? What happened? Who did you represent? What is going on in this case?
Sure, sure. So it's interesting that you say, and it's sad that we have to refer to it this way, but it's your run-of-the-mill standard abuse case involving a school, because my philosophy has always been it's always the same problems, it's always the same MO, and um, it just repeats itself again and again, and it tries as we do, we just see the same fact pattern all over again. So my client, who goes by a pseudonym, Jane Doe, um, she was a seventh grade student at Cooper B. Hatch Middle School, which is in Camden, New Jersey. Towards the end of that school year, her history teacher, a man by the name of Don Walker, started grooming her through compliments, through just paying special attention to her, isolating her, and at that age, just doing what young boys or young girls would love to hear is, you're pretty, you're beautiful, etc. um, and so interestingly, this occurs in the presence of two of her best friends, in the seventh grade, and they observe this. And actually, at one point, one of her friends, which you could just picture a typical, sort of seventh grade girlfriend doing, so her friend screams out in the hallway down to her teacher, Mr. Walker, "Hey, Jane Doe likes you." And he then walks up to Jane Doe, bends over, whispers in her ear, "Well, Mr. Walker likes her too." And that's sort of where it all starts.
And
Uh,
just for perspective, for those of us who don't have kids, seventh grade is 13, 12, 13 years old.
sure, yeah,
Yeah.
yes. Usually
Okay.
starting at 12 and ending at 13.
Mhm.
So we have a 13-year-old child, and this sort of grooming relationship starting to happen. Um,
And he's how old at this time? He's a teacher, he's an
yeah,
adult, but is he one of the
he's in his mid 20s. He's
Okay,
actually in his first year of teaching. He
okay.
doesn't even have an educational educate. He didn't go to college for education, and he doesn't have a full teaching license either. He has an emergency certificate, which he keeps for the next 7 or 8 years, which became an issue in the case. Is how is that an emergency if you're renewing your emergency certificate for 8 years? This grooming starts to happen towards the end of the seventh grade. He then isolates her in a room and kisses her and fondles her. She doesn't know how to react, which is typical for survivors. Frankly, from my experience, whether they're children or adults, they just don't know how to react. And I mean, there is no perfect way to react. And she freezes. But by the same time, she did like him. She had a crush on him, and that's also typical in these
Mm-hmm.
cases as well. So she sees him again in the eighth grade. This continues, but now it escalates. And it escalates to a point where he starts taking her to local motels. And we're talking seedy motels, the type you one would rent by the hour. And he abuses her in every worst way imaginable during her eighth grade year. And then even she graduates middle school, she goes into high school, and this continues even into her high school years. And then I guess he decides he doesn't want to keep paying for motels, so he has her meet him at his house, which was right near her high school. And they continue he continues to abuse her in the high school, or I'm sorry, in the house near the high school.
And did she ever report this?
So we look at it the other way around.
Right.
She did not report it, which of course is typical, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, here's what happens. So, first off, she's being pulled out of class constantly.
Mm-hmm.
So, the theory that we pursued was simply, well, look, if one teacher keeps pulling your student out of class time and time again every day, or nearly every day, then that should be the first red flag, right? So the principal at the middle school actually approaches her about this and says, "Hey, why do you spend so much time with Mr. Walker?" And she denies it, and she says, "Oh, I'm just cleaning the classroom, helping him out, things like that." But I always say, if you're at the point, especially as a school administrator, especially as a principal, if you're at the point where you're asking questions, that means you're suspicious, or
Well,
you're
and if you're the one noticing, because principals have a lot on their plate, if
right.
it's happening so much that you're noticing, it's a lot.
Correct. So she denies it, and she denies it for good reason. He told her to deny if ever asked. In fact, he went so far as to say, if anybody ever shows you a picture of us together, deny that it's you. Say that's not me in the picture. So she was very compliant. She was a sort of shy, quiet girl, and he knew it. And he knew that she was going to follow his lead, his instructions. So she denied it. So, ninth grade, this goes to the next level. You ask about whether any questions were asked. So, one day, another teacher that she knew from the middle school sees Mr. Walker and Jane Doe coming out of his house in Camden, New Jersey. She's driving by, it's during the school day, and her antenna goes up and says, "Wait, I'm concerned. Why is she not in school? Why is he not in school? Why are they together?" And rightfully,
Why
and
are
it's
they at his house?
right, exactly. What's going on here? And so she is also a first year student, or sorry, first year teacher, and she asks questions. And that actually became a theme during the trial and during the closing arguments, was about who stayed silent and who spoke up. So she goes to Jane Doe and to Jane Doe's two friends, who by this point knew all about this, and said, "What's going on between Jane and Mr. Walker?" And they are, young kids, students, and they don't have a filter, and they say, "Well, they like each other. They're friends that way. They like each other." So the other teacher says, "Well, he better watch himself. He's a grown man. He needs to stay away from her." So again, more evidence that they knew or that they had suspicions.
But she says this to the two children. Does she say this to any adults?
Well, she does. I'll get to that.
Okay.
So she says that to the two kids. She actually then reaches out to Jane Doe's mother and calls her and says, "Hey, what's going on here?" Which on the surface seems like a reasonable thing to do, right? However, when you look at the training and the best practices out there, that's not what she's supposed to do for good reason. First of all, she should have never asked Jane Doe directly, who also
Mhm.
denied it. She shouldn't have asked the two friends, and she
Mhm.
shouldn't have called the parent. The policies in the school said you don't reach out to the parents, guardians, friends, or the victim directly because you're really not in a position to be doing investigation. You're a teacher, teach, right?
Yes.
Teach, supervise, but don't ask questions. And there's a very clear, as most schools have, there was a clear policy that she report this to the principal. And had she done so, of course, our theory was very simple. Is, well, the principal knew she was constantly being taken out of class. Had she reported to the principal, well, now there's a second red flag coming up. So she didn't do that. She reaches out to the mom. The mom asks Jane Doe, "Hey, what's going on? I got a call from your old teacher that you were seen with this other teacher." And Renee, venture a guess as to what Jane Doe says.
We're just friends. It wasn't me. Actually, no, he told her to deny. We deny. It wasn't me. I was
It
in class.
wasn't me. Exactly. So that's left at that. And, that's kind of exactly why. And so the policy said you report to the principal, but also the policy said, and the law said, you have to report to Child Protective Services, which at the time in New Jersey was called DIFUS, or Division of Youth
Mhm.
and Family Services. And, why is that? Well, it's real simple. Those
They're
are
the investigators.
They're investigators. They're the ones who are trained to do this, but most importantly, they're neutral. Think about if your principal called you in as a seventh grader, eighth grader, ninth grader down to the office and starts questioning you about this. You're going to deny everything because you don't want to be in trouble and you don't want anyone else to be in trouble. So,
Mhm.
however, if you bring in Child Protective Services, somebody who's trained, who's not judgmental, knows how to talk, and basically is wearing the white hat and is the savior, then that child is going to tell.
Did anybody in the school system have a conversation with him? Like, we seem to be having a lot of chats with her and her friends and her family. Did anybody go to him and say,
Interest,
"What are you doing?"
interesting point. There was no evidence that anybody ever went to him about it. And interestingly, there was no dispute that the teacher who had observed this coming out of the house together
Mhm.
actually had dated him. And so even though she knew him personally, she didn't even confront him. Now, I don't want to, sort of throw this other teacher under the bus because ultimately she did the right thing. And when we confronted her, did I mention, by the way, this happened 31 years ago?
Right.
So when we reached out to her, we located her. She confirmed everything that she saw. She stuck by it and she told her truth.
Wow. Now, interestingly, there's so many places we could go with this case. I'm going to follow this thread, but try to pull us back. It's 30 years later, so the statute of limitations is passed. And that's why we really like to look at these cases, because sometimes, and that's why we call it parallel justice, because the criminal justice system can't always give
Accommodate. Yeah.
give closure to victims that the civil justice system can. So the criminal statute of limitations is passed. Um, does he continue in these 30 years? Are there any other evidences? And I know you had him on the stand, so maybe that's something to talk about too.
Sure. Yeah.
What
So,
what happened on the stand?
well,
What did he admit to? What did he not admit to? What did you learn?
let me get to that in a second because I think it is a good talking point to talk about how the statute of limitations worked here. So at the time, and this started to happen in the early 90s, 91, 92, 93. At the time, the criminal statute of limitations was only 5 years, 5 years from the date of majority, which is 18. So basically by her 20s. She is now 45 years old. So her criminal statute of limitations is gone. And so the only choice that she had, and she tried filing a police report in 2020 when she came forward.
Mhm.
They took the report, but they couldn't do anything because of statute of limitations. So the only choice she had was to bring a civil case, which thankfully, in the state of New Jersey had opened up their statute of limitations civilly. And they had opened up a 2 year, what we call window. Uh, if you bring your case within that 2 year window, then it'll be considered timely. Also in New Jersey, it goes to age 55 of the victim. So she met both requirements, although you don't need to meet both requirements. And so we filed our lawsuit in 2021. Um, the other interesting thing is during the course of this lawsuit, and we talk, it's called parallel justice, but there's actually multiple avenues.
Mhm.
So there was a third avenue here, and that was administratively. So in the course of this case, when it became public, which we'll talk about in a second, like very public, Dyfus ends up reaching out to my client, interviewing her, interviewing all the witnesses. Their investigation, to my knowledge, is still going on. So there could be repercussions for the school. There could be repercussions for him administratively from a licensure standpoint. So back to your question, Renee. So we go forward in the case, and his story, well, let me set this up. He is a practicing Muslim following Nation of Islam, and he is also a minister. He refers to himself as and he changed his name to a Muslim name, Wasim Muhammad. Um, so he leads a temple in Camden, Islamic temple, Muslim temple, and he happens to have 5 wives presently. One, which he refers to as his legal wife, four of whom are quote unquote spiritual wives. So he's on the stand, and I actually didn't know the full breadth of this in throughout the discovery process. When I got to take his deposition, I I knew that he had multiple wives, but I didn't know the backstory on them. So we start digging into it, and we find out that 4 of his wives he met and started dating when they were either 17 or 18 and either still in high school or freshly graduated from high school.
Were they in his high school?
Yes, some of them were. And we got the backstory of how they met, where they met, etc. So, um, and he had another wife who he was no longer married to. So 4 out of his 6 wives he met at 17 or 18. I asked him on the stand, is that true? He said, yes. I said, do you see a pattern here? And he said, well, if you want to say so. So he admitted to that. And that sort of became a big headline in the case during the trial as well, too. What was important, though, from a case standpoint and everything is, and I tried to do this, I think I did this, I could not attack this religion. I mean, both on First Amendment grounds and just as a general strategy. I can't attack an entire religion or his religious beliefs either. But
And nor do we want to. If they're
correct,
genuinely held, nor do we want to. But we've had Marcy Hamilton talk about this. We've had everybody talk about this. You cannot use religion as a
as
guide for abuse.
right. So his story became that he was married to Jane Doe at 18, which was not true. She denied that. And so we had to explore that a little bit. And really, what the narrative became is, so let me understand something. And I left a little part of the story out. So in the ninth grade, three-quarters of the way through the school year, she ends up moving. Her whole family moves down south. She moves away. She no longer goes to the high school. She thinks she's never going to see him again. Lo and behold, he shows up and he goes down south, tracks her down, takes her out of the high school in the south, and abuses her in hotels there as well on at least two occasions, possibly three occasions. So he just won't go away. So she's 15, 16 years old at that point, and he convinces her to move back to New Jersey and live with him, which she does. She doesn't deny that that happened. At 18 years old, she lives with him for about 10 months. They live together. He has, at this point, multiple wives, and he goes around house to house to the different wives. And until one very horrific story, um, and this was literally the last straw for her. He takes her to a porn theater, and this is in the mid to late 90s, and essentially offers her up to a friend of his uh, to be raped while he watches and masturbates. She, the next day, says, I have to get out of here. And she escapes essentially in the middle of the night and leaves and never goes back, right? She continues to stay in contact with him. And that's another sort of talking point here. And we all think that when a woman or a man is sexually assaulted, they're going to go running down to the police the next day. And that's the exception. That's not the rule.
Mm-hmm.
So the reality is that victims stay in contact with their perpetrators. And there's a bunch of reasons why. One reason is they don't want to believe that it happened. They don't want to think that it's sexual assault. So the more that they can normalize their relationship and the activity, then in their mind, maybe it didn't happen, or maybe if it happened, it wasn't a rape.
It was a misunderstanding. Maybe they can normalize that person because they've idolized this person for so long. They're not a monster.
Yeah, sure. And we all want to create order in our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this became an issue for the defense. The defense was trying to say, well, this was all consensual because look at, she stayed in contact with him for years, and you wouldn't do that. So we ended up bringing in an expert on this, a psychologist. Her name is Dr. Veronique Valliere. So Dr. Valliere wrote a book about 4 or 5 years ago called Understanding Victims of Interpersonal Violence. It's available on Amazon and all over the internet. It's a quick read. It's about 150 pages. And boy, did I get an education when I read that book. Even though I've been representing victims for decades, I understood best for the first time why it is that victims do what they do. Why don't they tell? Why don't they? Why do they stay in
Mm-hmm.
contact? Why, all that kind of stuff. She explains it all in a very quick read. The book was written for prosecutors and investigators, but I have not met anybody that didn't get something out of it. And I recommend it to all my clients, and it's an excellent resource. So we had her come in as a witness, expert witness.
And she was able to explain most of this.
She explained all of it, and it was so in line with everything that's in her book. And she basically gave a full education on why generally victims stay in contact, don't report, and why in this particular case Jane Doe denied things and stayed in contact. And essentially, also a good point is that Jane Doe didn't recognize this as a sexual assault or rape until somebody explained it to her,
Hmm.
that she couldn't consent as a child. And what's interesting also, legally speaking, when the legislature in New Jersey opened up the civil statute of limitations, they not only opened it up for victims of child sexual abuse, but they opened it up for adults as well, too. So we had this, sure, this abuse starts at around age 13, but it continued on into adulthood, which raises the issue as if a perpetrator sexually abuses a child while under the age of majority, but then engages in sexual contact after that child reaches 18 or the age of majority, is that really consensual? And so that became an issue too. And our case, we filed a lawsuit for both parts of that.
Well, let's talk about the lawsuit and the verdict, because the Camden City School District's attorney said at the end of after the verdict, so you got $1.6 million.
Right.
The other side is claiming victory. The city attorney said at the end of the day, this jury did not find Mr. Muhammad sexually assaulted the plaintiff in this case. But you still got $1.6 million plus another $2 million. So can you explain
Sure. I'll do my
this
best.
confusion?
So when we bring lawsuits, we bring different counts, so different theories of liability. And as the plaintiff, you get to choose what theories or what counts you bring. And that's what we did. So we brought a number of different counts, probably about 10 or more, and they go in front of the jury, and the jury answers questions about them. And the first two questions were, did he commit an act of assault? Did he commit a battery? And there's legal definitions for them. And they answered no, which of course was very concerning as you're sitting in the courtroom and hearing no, no. The third theory was, did he commit what's called intentional infliction of emotional distress? And that's just simply, did he do something either intentionally or recklessly which caused her emotional distress? And the jury said yes. So he is to this day running around claiming victory on that.
Yes.
I
And he's in a position, and I think everybody should know he's in a position of power. He's never, first of all, not only has he never been held accountable, he's now in an interesting position.
Well, I take issue when you say he wasn't held accountable. He was held
He was
accountable
held
by this
accountable.
jury's verdict. Um,
But
so
he would not acknowledge that.
so let's fast forward. And interestingly, Jane Doe comes forward for the first time at around age 42 or 43 in 2020, middle of the
Mhm.
pandemic. And interestingly, also, which is a common element, is it's she develops even worse symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder when her daughter, her oldest child, becomes the age that she was at the time that her abuse started. And so she just couldn't take it anymore. She had profound changes in her activity and her life, that she couldn't sleep in the same room as her husband. She couldn't enjoy certain things, like such as sunsets or certain songs or
Mhm.
music, because they were a reminder of the abuse that this teacher had committed upon her. So that's all 2020. She comes forward, and literally, I was the first person or one of the first people that she told about the abuse, which is not uncommon either. Well, also in 2020, Mr. Muhammad decides to enter the political arena, and he runs for public office. Not just any office, he runs to have a seat on the school board in the school, that oversaw the school that he worked in. He wins, and not only does he win, his other board members take a vote and elect him as board president. So he happens to be the board the what's called advisory school board president of Camden City School District, and he is still that to today, June of 2024.
The governor has called for him to step down, correct?
Yeah, so we filed this lawsuit in 2021. It doesn't really become newsworthy or headlines or anything until just this year, January of 2024. Not exactly sure why it took that long for somebody to pick up on this. And there was a couple of articles that came out. Governor Murphy, Phil Murphy, put out a statement asking him, or he doesn't actually have power to fire him, but
Right.
essentially demanding that he resign.
Does
As
anybody have power to remove this man? Is there any authority that has the power?
Sure. Well, first of
Okay.
all, the voters do, but
Okay.
more importantly than that, the school board does. The school board
Okay.
does, and or the school superintendent. So the activists start picking up on this and showing up at school board meetings and saying, "Why is this man still president of the school board? Why is he still on the school board?" He temporarily takes a leave of absence from the school board for the last 4 or 5 months now, and he has not shown back up. The law in New Jersey says if you miss 3 meetings, then you can be kicked off immediately just for missing meetings, right? So that's what happens. But he is still to this day on the school board.
Now we skipped over an important part. That's okay. Um, you got a punitive settlement yesterday.
Let
Do
me
you want to
clarify.
explain
Yeah.
that part? That's crucial.
All right. Let me clarify that. So the case. Let me set it up. So the verdict was in mid-May, and that was on what we call compensatory damages. And compensatory damages are just what does the jury assess is the value of her losses, her harms. And but at the same time, they are asked, do you believe that these defendants either acted maliciously or willfully or wantonly? And they answered yes, that both the the alleged perpetrator did and the school district did. And if so, and they answer yes to those questions, then they get to decide punitive damages. And punitive damages are different than compensatory damages. That is, what amount of money punishes the defendant for their conduct, either intentional or malicious conduct. And so what happens is in New Jersey is that gets split up. The trial gets split up. So you have the compensatory, we'll call that phase one, and then you have a phase two. So phase two was supposed to go and start yesterday, mid June, a month later. The case ended up getting settled in total just prior to the start of that portion of the trial, and the settlement was $2 million across the board. So
So
that's
wait, they just paid an extra 400. So is it 1.6 plus the two?
1.6 plus 400,000, 2
Gotcha.
million
2
total.
million total. Okay.
And you might say, well, why? Why was it that way? And it's real simple. You never know what's going to happen on appeal. The
Hmm.
school board had the district had taken steps to ask for a new trial, asked that the verdict be overturned, and basically was setting up its appeal. You never know what's going to happen on appeal.
Hmm.
Frankly, this client of mine, as a survivor, needed to begin to see some degree of closure,
Hmm.
and with this, with guaranteed accountability and closure, and that's her decision. And I think it's a good decision. But our work is not done simply because the guy is still on the school board and the school district. And this became an interesting point in the trial, too. You know, and we've seen this since 2011 when Jerry Sandusky was arrested and lawsuits were brought against Penn State. I had represented a number of victims of Jerry Sandusky, but what you saw, and that was a major change, a watershed event with Penn State and Sandusky. But you saw institutions begin to take responsibility. And by doing so, a model was set up really by Penn State. I'm sure people had done it before, institutions had done it before. But the model was, let's appoint an independent person or panel to investigate this.
Hmm.
With Penn State, they hired the former FBI director, Louis Freeh, who conducted a pretty thorough examination. and it issued a pretty lengthy report. And, you know, they accepted that and proceeded. With Larry Nasser, with Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, there's always some sort of investigation that's done involving whatever institutions at play. This school district never conducted an investigation to this day.
Well,
Never.
because he's the head of the school district, the one making the decisions.
Correct. And I asked him about that on the stand. I said, "Did you ever ask for an investigation?" No. Did you ever step down or say that I need to step aside? Or no, no, no. But he had the power to do so. So it was an interesting scenario where he is both a defendant and the head of the school board.
Well, and in theory, not always, but those who have done nothing wrong want that investigation.
Yeah, excellent point, Renee.
So the fact that he is saying, no, I didn't, well, why wouldn't you do an investigation?
Right.
Why not?
So that's why, well, in this case, they don't want to do an investigation because the truth is the truth and they don't want to find that out, right? But that's why I've said, and Jane Doe has said, and continues to say, our work is not done. Our work is not done until this school district is cleaned up its act in terms of their policies, their training. And that was part of the problem here. I told you about that teacher who saw something, said
Hmm.
something, but just said it to the wrong people, said it to children, should have said it to the principal, should have contacted DIFUS.
So let's close by talking a little bit about your clients because I don't always like to get so deep into the wrongdoers. I think they get enough attention as it is.
So, in ways, she's doing well. On the surface, she's doing well. In reality, she's not doing well.
Okay.
She continues under, I believe it's weekly counseling. She's been diagnosed with post traumatic stress disorder. And that's extremely common in these cases.
Hmm.
Post traumatic stress is when there's a traumatic event, and then when there's reminders of that traumatic event, and they could be literally a smell, a perfume, a cologne,
Hmm.
a sound. In this case, the perpetrator had introduced her to jazz, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Stevie Wonder. When she can't listen to that music to this day without breaking down. She
Yeah.
can't, I had mentioned, she can't eat, she doesn't even sleep in the same bed or bedroom as her husband. And she has 3 children. She went on to become an educator herself. So she's an elementary school teacher, which she loves and hates at the same time because it's, every day imagine going to a setting that's similar to the setting where you became traumatized in. So it's one giant constant reminder. But I think her love for education and teaching children, guiding children, protecting children, most importantly, uh, wins out at the end of the day for her. So she struggles through that. And she really wants to continue to advocate in this area. And we're going to see her do more of that and hopefully even work with the National Center in educating folks around the country.
And she chose to file under a pseudonym under Jane Doe. Um, how did that protect her? And do you think she'll ever want people to know who she is?
Sure. So, just as a general comment, I find that survivors of sexual abuse fall into usually one extreme category or another one. They either don't want anybody to know their names, and that's fine, um, or they absolutely want people to know their names. And there is no right or wrong answer on that. That's an individual choice. And I have to be cognizant of that. I literally have a case that I'm pursuing where I have 35 clients in the case. Half of them want their names attached to it, and half of them absolutely don't. So she chose to proceed under a pseudonym, which affords her some protection in all public filings, and where her name is not exposed or her identifying information is not exposed. It allows her to come forward and speak openly. However, I've also had other clients that do this. She may be reaching a point where, as an advocate, she wants to identify herself, and that may happen very soon.
All right, Jeff. Well, that is about all the time we have for today. But as always, I want to give you a moment to leave our listeners with any last thoughts you have on this.
Sure. So this program, Parallel Justice, this case really speaks to exactly that. And here's a case where this woman would gladly not have gotten $1 for this had she had the ability to have him prosecuted. That, of course, is number one. Um, but just because of the way the law operates, and by the way, the good news is in New Jersey, there is no statute of limitations anymore criminally. So somebody can be pursued years, decades later, criminally. So that's a good forward steps in the process. But this case is an example of that two systems of justice working to get some degree of accountability, responsibility, and closure for this victim, for this survivor. And I'm proud to be a member of the National Crime Victim Bar Association because this is what we've been doing for how long now, Renee?
30 years.
Yeah, something like that. And I always feel good when we can do something to get some measure of justice where just because of the nature of the laws, they couldn't pursue criminal justice.
Good last thought. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another episode of Parallel Justice. As always, we will put all of Jeff's contact information into the show notes so you can learn more about him and contact him if you are a victim of crime. And as always, please listen for another episode. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you have any questions about your rights after listening to this show, please visit us at victimsofcrime.org. Our guests' information is also always available in the show notes. This podcast was created by the National Center for Victims of Crime in partnership with our center and affiliate, the National Crime Victim Bar Association. More information about both organizations is available at victimsofcrime.org and victimbar.org. Thank you, and please join us again next week.